There are questions you're never supposed to ask in church, not because they're evil, but because once you ask them, the answers don't come easily. You're told the Bible has all the answers, but what if some of its most important claims create more confusion than clarity? Tonight, we're not mocking faith, we're not preaching disbelief, we're doing something far more dangerous. We're asking the questions that sermons quietly skip, questions that sound simple, but unravel fast. And once you hear them, you'll never read the Bible the same way again. God is all-loving. We are told God is love itself, not loving in the way humans are loving, flawed and inconsistent, but perfect love, infinite compassion, a love so complete that it exists beyond emotion, beyond mood, beyond circumstance. This idea is usually presented as the foundation of everything, before commandments, before judgment, before fear. And yet, when you sit with it long enough, a tension begins to form that is hard to ignore. Because this same all-loving God is said to create a reality where disbelief carries the harshest possible consequence. Not cruelty, not violence, not harm to others, but doubt, skepticism, simply not being convinced. That is where the question quietly enters. If love is truly unconditional, why does it demand belief under threat of eternal punishment? We are told love does not coerce. We repeat it in weddings, in poetry, in therapy. Love cannot be forced. Love must be chosen freely, or it becomes something else entirely. And yet fear sits at the center of this system. Fear of hell, fear of separation, fear of being wrong forever. When fear becomes the motivator, love begins to feel less like an invitation and more like a demand. The response from the church is almost always the same. It is not about fear, they say. It is about justice. God is just. Sin must be addressed. But justice without mercy feels cold, and mercy without real choice feels hollow. If the punishment is infinite, then the scale is already tilted. No human legal system would call it fair to impose an eternal sentence for a finite mistake. And disbelief is not even an action, it is a state of mind. A conclusion reached after experience, reasoning, and reflection. To punish that endlessly raises a deeper question about the nature of justice itself. And then comes the quiet contradiction. If God desires relationship, why design a system where honest doubt becomes the ultimate offense? Why would a loving being value belief over integrity? Why reward certainty and punish sincerity? These questions are rarely addressed directly, not because they are malicious, but because they are destabilizing. They force us to ask whether love is really the foundation, or whether obedience is, and that is where the cracks begin to show, not in the idea of love itself, but in the way the system around it is constructed. Free will exists. Free will is described as sacred in Christianity. It is presented as the great gift that separates humans from machines, animals, and angels. You must choose God freely, because forced love would be meaningless. Choice is everything. Without it, faith would be hollow. But the moment you slow down and examine the setup, the simplicity of that claim begins to dissolve. Because free will does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a framework, and frameworks shape outcomes long before a choice is ever made. You are born into a belief system you did not select. Long before you can reason, you are taught what is true and what is dangerous. You are told who God is, what He expects, and what happens if you are wrong. Consequences are explained before alternatives are fully understood. Hell is introduced before doubt, obedience before exploration. By the time questioning becomes possible, the emotional stakes are already sky high. Fear has already been wired into the decision-making process. So the question becomes unavoidable. Is that freedom, or is it pressure with eternal consequences attached? If the cost of choosing incorrectly is infinite suffering, the choice is no longer neutral. In every other area of life, we recognize this immediately. A choice made under threat is not considered free. A confession extracted under extreme punishment is dismissed. Yet when the stakes become cosmic, we are told the rules somehow change. True freedom allows you to walk away without being destroyed for doing so. It allows genuine rejection, but hell makes walking away unimaginably expensive. It turns disbelief into the most dangerous decision a human can make. At that point, Belief begins to resemble self-preservation more than conviction. You believe not because you are persuaded, but because the alternative is unbearable. This reframes faith in a disturbing way. If free will exists only within a narrow corridor, where one option leads to eternal safety and all others lead to ruin, then the freedom is conditional at best. The choice is technically available, but emotionally impossible. And suddenly, the idea of free will no longer feels like a gift. It feels negotiated, structured, managed. A freedom that exists in theory, but collapses under the weight of its consequences. Faith is a virtue. The Bible openly praises belief without evidence. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet believe. This line is often delivered gently, as if it is comforting, as if it elevates trust into something holy. Faith, we are told, is a virtue precisely because it does not rely on proof. It is meant to rise above evidence, above verification, above the limits of human reason. And for many believers, this idea feels noble, pure, almost heroic. But the moment you step outside a religious context, the same behavior takes on a very different meaning. In every other area of life, believing without evidence is not celebrated, it is warned against. We call it gullibility when someone accepts claims without proof. We call it manipulation when authority figures demand trust while discouraging verification. We teach children to question strangers, to ask for sources, to think critically. Skepticism is treated as a survival skill. So why does this rule suddenly reverse when the subject becomes God? Why does faith become noble only in this one domain? If truth is real, it should withstand examination. Real things do not require you to close your eyes. Gravity does not demand belief. Fire does not punish doubt. Reality proves itself regardless of whether you trust it. So when a belief system insists that doubt is a flaw rather than a tool, something feels off. If doubt is punished, honesty becomes dangerous. You are no longer rewarded for being sincere. You are rewarded for being compliant. The church often responds by saying, faith builds humility, that it teaches you to accept your limitations, to trust something greater than yourself. And humility, in itself, can be healthy. But there is a line where humility quietly turns into submission, where questions stop being welcomed and start being seen as threats. When curiosity is reframed as rebellion, faith begins to function less like trust and more like control. Because doubt is not arrogance. Doubt is a response to uncertainty. It is the mind asking for coherence. When doubt is suppressed, people learn to silence parts of themselves in order to belong. They learn to nod instead of think, to repeat instead of reflect. Over time, this creates a fragile belief system, one that depends not on truth, but on silence. A belief system that fears questions rarely welcomes truth. It survives by protecting itself from scrutiny rather than engaging with it. And once belief is defined as virtue precisely because it avoids evidence, the question becomes unavoidable. Is faith pointing you toward truth or training you to stop looking for it? Prayer changes things. We are told prayer moves mountains, that it heals the sick, changes outcomes, and alters the course of reality itself. From the pulpit, prayer is described as a direct line to God, a force that can bend circumstances and intervene in moments of desperation. People are encouraged to pray harder, longer, with more faith. The implication is clear. If prayer works, it works because God responds, and if it does not, the fault is never with the system. But when you step back and look at the pattern, something uncomfortable emerges. Millions of people pray every day for the same things: healing, safety, relief. Some recover, some do not. Some survive against all odds. Others die despite relentless prayer. And the explanation never comes before the outcome. It always arrives after. If healing happens, prayer is credited. If it does not, the answer shifts. God had another plan. The timing was not right. The lesson was different. The logic adapts to the result. This raises a quiet but important question. What exactly is prayer doing? Is it a request line where outcomes are negotiated? Is it a test of obedience, a way to demonstrate submission regardless of the result? Or is it emotional comfort, a psychological anchor when reality feels unbearable and uncontrollable? None of these possibilities are inherently wrong, but only one of them matches the promises that are often made. If prayer truly changes outcomes, then results should differ in measurable ways. But when outcomes remain statistically indistinguishable from chance, prayer begins to look less like intervention and more like ritual. A repeated action that provides meaning, structure, and emotional relief, but does not alter external reality. And rituals can be powerful. They calm anxiety. They create a sense of control. They bring people together, but power is not the same as effectiveness. When prayer is framed as a solution and fails to deliver, doubt quietly enters. Not dramatic doubt, not rebellious doubt, just the soft question that forms in the back of the mind. If the outcome was always going to be the same, why was prayer presented as the mechanism? And if the answer can never be wrong, only reinterpreted, how could it ever be tested? Rituals without results do not shatter faith instantly. They erode it slowly, one unanswered prayer at a time. God is unchanging. The Bible says God never changes. He is described as the same yesterday, today, and forever. Perfect, complete, unaffected by time or culture. This idea is meant to inspire trust. If God is unchanging, then truth is stable. Morality is anchored. Nothing shifts beneath your feet. But the moment you compare different parts of the Bible, a tension appears that is hard to dismiss. Because while God is said to be unchanging, the rules clearly are not. In the Old Testament, laws demand executions for actions that today feel minor, even cruel. Working on the wrong day, disobeying parents, violating ritual purity. Entire communities are commanded to be wiped out. Justice is severe and uncompromising. Then, in the New Testament, the tone shifts dramatically. Forgiveness replaces punishment. Grace replaces law. Love replaces fear. The message becomes softer, more humane, more aligned with modern moral instincts, and the question becomes unavoidable. What changed? Was it God, or was it the story being told about him? If morality evolves over time, adapting to human understanding and social development, why is divine morality described as fixed? And if divine morality truly never changes, why does it appear to mirror the moral progress of the cultures recording it? The more humanity grows, the more compassionate the portrayal becomes. That pattern feels less like revelation and more like reflection. The church often resolves this tension with a phrase that sounds reassuring but explains very little: progressive revelation. The idea that God slowly revealed his true nature over time as people became ready to understand it. But this explanation hides a deeper issue. If God was always loving and just, why were earlier generations given laws that appear violent and harsh? Why were they held to standards that later became obsolete? This leads to an uncomfortable fork in the road. Either God was unclear, allowing generations to act in his name in ways we now consider immoral, or people misunderstood him, projecting their own values and fears onto the divine. In both cases, the problem is not minor. It means human interpretation played a central role in shaping what was called God's will. An unchanging God paired with changing commands forces a difficult realization. The certainty offered by the claim begins to weaken. And once you see that moral clarity shifts across the text, the idea of a perfectly fixed divine standard starts to feel far less certain than it was meant to. The Bible is divinely inspired. The Bible is described as divinely inspired, not dictated word for word, but guided by God's influence. At the same time, it is openly acknowledged to be written by men. Men shaped by their cultures, their politics, their fears, and their limitations. From the very beginning, this creates a tension that is rarely explored out loud. Inspiration suggests perfection of message, while human authorship guarantees imperfection of execution, and between those two claims sits the entire foundation of belief. The text was copied by hand for centuries, translated across languages with no direct equivalents, edited, compiled, and selected from competing writings. Books were included, others were excluded. Councils debated doctrine, while empires rose and fell around them, and all of this happened long after the original events were said to occur. If God wanted clarity, this method feels strangely fragile. A perfect message, entrusted to an imperfect process, is an invitation to distortion. Contradictions appear not at the margins, but at the center. Genealogies that do not align, timelines that conflict, teachings that point in different directions depending on which author is speaking. Entire doctrines hinge on single words that change meaning across translations. Faith versus faithfulness, hell versus the grave, eternal versus age-lasting. These are not minor details. They shape how people understand salvation, punishment, and the nature of God Himself. Yet, when confusion arises, the blame rarely falls on the text. It falls on the reader. You did not study enough. You did not pray enough. You lacked the right heart posture. Doubt is framed as a personal failure rather than a reasonable response to ambiguity. The possibility that the message itself might be unclear is quietly dismissed because acknowledging it would destabilize authority. A perfect message filtered through imperfect hands does not produce certainty. It produces interpretation, layers of meaning shaped by translators, theologians, and power structures. An interpretation always involves choice. Which verse matters more? Which context applies? Which explanation feels safe? Asking someone to stake their eternity on such a process places an enormous burden on belief. It requires not just faith in God, but faith in every human link in the chain. And once that realization settles in, the question is no longer whether doubt is sinful. The question is whether doubt is inevitable. Jesus died for your sins. This is the core claim, the center of the entire belief system. Strip everything else away and you are left with this idea. Someone else paid your moral debt. Humanity was guilty. God was just. Jesus became the solution. It is presented as the ultimate act of love, voluntary sacrifice, infinite mercy, wrapped in suffering. And for many, it feels profound, comforting even. But the moment you slow down and examine the logic behind it, the emotional power begins to clash with moral reasoning. If justice means accountability, why is punishment transferable at all? In every human system, we recognize that responsibility cannot be outsourced. Guilt does not move from one person to another simply because someone volunteers to suffer. A judge who punished an innocent person to absolve the guilty would not be praised as just. They would be condemned. Yet when this same structure appears in theology, it is reframed as divine wisdom. If forgiveness is the goal, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why demand blood at all? Why require suffering before mercy is granted? Forgiveness, by definition, is the release of a debt. It is not a transaction. It does not require violence to be meaningful. And yet the narrative insists that without sacrifice, forgiveness is impossible. That God could not simply forgive. He had to punish someone first. This creates a disturbing implication. That justice is not about restoration, but about appeasement. That moral balance requires pain. And that love, no matter how infinite, is constrained by a rule that demands suffering before compassion can act. This does not resemble moral growth. It resembles ritual logic. Ancient systems where gods demanded offerings to be satisfied. In human terms, punishing an innocent to absolve the guilty is not justice. It is tragedy. It violates the very moral instincts that Christianity itself claims to cultivate. We teach that scapegoating is wrong. That collective punishment is unjust. That responsibility is personal. And yet the central doctrine asks you to accept all three in one sweeping act. This is where the explanation often turns symbolic. Jesus did not just die, we are told. He represented humanity. He embodied sin. He fulfilled a cosmic requirement. But symbolism does not solve the moral problem. It softens it. It shifts the focus away from logic and toward meaning. And meaning can feel true even when reasoning is strained. Which raises the quiet question few are encouraged to ask. Is this theology grounded in coherent moral principles? Or is it mythology, a symbolic story designed to explain suffering, guilt, and hope in a way that resonates emotionally rather than logically? Because the moment you remove the sacred framing, what remains is a system where innocence is punished, guilt is transferred, and justice is redefined to make it work. And once you see that, clearly, the story changes shape in your hands. Hell is necessary. Hell is often presented as a necessity, a moral requirement. Without it, justice would collapse, evil would go unanswered, the universe would be unfair. This framing makes hell sound reasonable, even responsible, a final balancing of the scales. But the moment you examine what hell is said to be, the logic begins to fracture. Eternal punishment for finite actions violates every human standard of fairness we have ever developed. No crime committed in a limited lifespan justifies infinite suffering, not even the worst ones. And yet divine justice is said to demand exactly that. This raises a disturbing question. If our moral instincts tell us that endless torture is unjust, where did those instincts come from? Christianity claims they come from God, that humans reflect divine morality. But if that is true, why does divine justice appear harsher than human justice at its most extreme? Why would a perfect moral being endorse a punishment we would immediately condemn if applied by any human authority? The problem deepens when hell is linked not just to actions, but to belief, disbelief, doubt, the absence of conviction. If hell exists primarily to deter disbelief, then fear becomes the foundation of faith. Belief is no longer the result of being persuaded by truth. It becomes a strategy for avoiding pain. You believe because the alternative is unbearable, not because the claim has convinced you. Faith built on fear is not devotion. It is survival. It is the psychological response of a being trapped between uncertainty and threat. And survival behavior looks very different from genuine trust. It suppresses questions. It rewards conformity. It punishes honesty. Over time, fear-trained faith teaches people to guard their thoughts, not explore them. This changes everything about the relationship between believer and God. The dynamic shifts from love to risk management, from connection to compliance. The question is no longer who God is, but what happens if you are wrong. That is not a relationship built on mutual trust. It is a relationship built on consequences. And once fear becomes the central motivator, hell stops functioning as justice. It becomes leverage, a psychological mechanism to enforce belief. At that point, the doctrine no longer explains morality. It explains control. And that realization quietly reframes the entire system, because a truth that requires infinite punishment to protect itself is no longer defending justice. It is defending belief at any cost. Questioning is dangerous. This is the quiet rule that rarely gets stated directly. Believe, but do not probe too deeply. Trust, but do not analyze. Accept, but do not challenge. On the surface, questioning is allowed in theory. In practice, it is tolerated only as long as it leads back to the approved conclusion. The moment questions begin to destabilize certainty, they are reframed as dangerous. Doubt becomes a moral flaw rather than an intellectual response. Yet truth does not fear questions. Real things do not collapse under examination. They become clearer. Strong ideas invite scrutiny because they have nothing to hide. Only fragile ideas need protection from curiosity. If God is real, inquiry should not threaten him. A creator of the universe would not be undone by honest human thought. And yet entire belief systems are structured around discouraging exactly that. People are often told that questioning leads to pride, confusion, or spiritual death, that too much thinking hardens the heart. But notice what this does psychologically. It trains people to distrust their own reasoning, to feel guilt for curiosity, to silence internal conflict instead of resolving it. Over time, this creates obedience without understanding, certainty without clarity. When belief collapses under scrutiny, the blame is rarely placed on the belief itself. It is placed on the person who asked. You were not sincere enough. You wanted to sin. You listened to the wrong voices. This shifts responsibility away from the idea and onto the individual. The belief remains protected. The questioner becomes the problem. But here is the question no sermon ends with. If a belief cannot survive honest examination, was it belief at all, or was it conditioning? Conditioning relies on repetition, authority, and fear of consequences. It discourages exploration because exploration threatens control. Belief, on the other hand, grows stronger when tested. It adapts, it deepens, it refines itself in response to challenge. The danger, then, is not questioning. The danger is what happens when people are taught that thinking is betrayal. Because once curiosity is framed as sin, truth becomes unreachable. And that quiet rule, more than any doctrine, ensures that many people never discover whether what they believe is true or simply what they were taught to never question. Here's the deeper truth. These questions don't destroy faith. They reveal its structure. Some beliefs survive examination. Others depend on silence. And maybe the real divide isn't between belief and disbelief, but between curiosity and fear. You don't have to abandon meaning to ask hard questions. You don't have to reject spirituality to demand coherence. Thinking isn't rebellion, it's responsibility. So keep questioning, keep pulling at loose threads, and never confuse comfort with truth. If this video made you pause, even for a moment, subscribe. Not for answers, but for better questions. Because belief should never come at the cost of your mind.